For the majority of history, ice was a luxury, something only nature could provide. No freezers or refrigerators existed until the late 1800s. If you lived in a hot climate, cold drinks were not a thing in most parts of the world, and food spoiled quickly if it wasn't dried or salted to oblivion. But in the early 19th century, a man from Boston cultivated his crazy idea: cut giant ice blocks out of ponds in wintertime Massachusetts and export to tropical, hot Caribbean islands, a journey of 2 weeks or more. Once you're there, sell the ice to people who have probably never seen frozen water. As soon as the locals get a taste of cold drinks and ice cream, the demand will explode and the cash will start rolling in. Frederick Tudor, the man who became known as the Ice King, created a business empire selling frozen water to the world, revolutionizing global trade and shaping the way we store and transport perishable goods today. Tudor was born in 1783 into a well-to-do Boston family. He grew up amid the city's maritime bustle, where ships constantly arrived from and departed to lands far away. Instead of following traditional paths, like attending Harvard, something offered to him, he chose hands-on learning in trade and commerce. While his brother William had more academic pursuits, Frederick's passion for entrepreneurial opportunities took center stage. From an early age, Frederick had witnessed how the wealthy stored ice in specifically built ice houses on their estates, carving out chunks to cool drinks or occasionally make ice cream. At the time, these were purely local luxuries, but Frederick saw a bigger picture. Warm climate regions had never experienced the simple pleasure of a chilled mojito. It was a potential gold mine.
Hola, mi amigos! Mojitos es en la casa!
At the age of 23, Tudor poured his savings into a brig, that's a two-masted sailing vessel, and packed it with ice harvested from New England ponds. In 1806, he set sail for the Caribbean island of Martinique, determined to turn tropical thirst into profit. He lined the ship's hold with straw and sawdust for insulation, sure that islanders would pay top dollar for cold drinks. Reality, however, quickly hit hard. The local population had never seen ice, at least not in large blocks. Few were equipped to store it, and most remained skeptical of the novelty. Tudor, confident in his product, refused to negotiate cheaper prices, waiting instead for the right buyers. By the time he lowered his rates, much of the 80-ton cargo had melted into the Caribbean sun, leaving him with a crushing $4,500 loss. Undaunted, he continued to load ships with straw, sawdust, and ice, sending them to Cuba and other tropical destinations. Free samples, demonstrations, and printed instructions became his sales toolkit. He recognized he wasn't just selling ice, but educating an entire market on how to use it. As Frederick juggled multiple voyages, his problems grew. He sometimes arrived in port only to find minimal interest. On top of that, the Tudor family's own finances took a severe downturn. Their once wealthy household suddenly carried staggering debts, forcing Frederick to shoulder more financial burdens. Then came the War of 1812, slamming the door shut on many commercial routes. Tudor's Caribbean ambitions stalled when U.S. trade was seriously interrupted by British naval blockades. With no active shipments, mounting debt, and no easy income, Tudor quickly found himself at odds with creditors. Lawyers hounded him, interest piled up, and at one point he was thrown into debtor's prison for a month until he paid down a fraction of what he owed. He spent idle months designing better ice houses and testing insulation materials. In 1815, when the war had ended, Tudor saw a glimmer of hope. The moment peace arrived, he was ready to seize new opportunities. Many vessels returning empty to the Caribbean would happily carry ice as ballast instead of rocks. He negotiated cut-rate freight costs. Despite resuming exports, Tudor's cash flow remained unpredictable in the years following the war. Any miscalculated bribe to officials, Any slight warmer weather or any rival's undercut price could tip an entire shipment into a money-losing voyage. From outward appearances, Frederick's enterprise was always on the verge of collapse, but behind the scenes, he was making incremental gains, experimenting with shipping schedules to capture peak tropical demand, and seeking local contractors to build the first real ice houses in the Caribbean. Tudor's dream was coming to life. As demand for ice grew, so did the need for a more efficient way to harvest it. Enter Nathaniel Wyeth. In the mid-1820s, Wyeth patented an ingenious horse-drawn plow that scored and partially cut the ice into uniform blocks. Workers would then finish the cuts with handsaws, pulling out neat blocks that could be stacked and insulated. These uniform blocks were loaded onto sleds or conveyor ramps, shipped off to a grand network of ice houses, then sent to ports for distribution. By the 1830s, Frederick Tudor's ambitions had gone global. Similar shipments reached Rio de Janeiro, Cuba, and eventually places as far off as Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia. Urban centers, New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, were exploding in population. Summers were hot, sanitation was poor, and daily life could be unpleasantly muggy. As ice prices dropped, due to the harvest efficiency, new middle-class families began buying ice for daily use. By the mid-19th century, restaurants, hotels, and street vendors offered iced beverages, from chilled water to novelty drinks like the mint julep and sherry cobbler. Early refrigeration machines leaked chemicals like ammonia into the ice, or required huge amounts of coal to power pumps and engines. This made plant ice expensive and lower in quality, often cloudy or containing residue. But as the century wore on, artificial ice plants finally began to gain traction. In many Northeast cities, entire neighborhoods relied on regular ice deliveries for food preservation and chilled drinks.
Pocket! 10-cent hump going up. Oh! Hey! You almost broke the ice! I'll break your head.
The natural ice trade had two major Achilles heels: reliance on cold winters and the growing threat of reliable artificial refrigeration. Some years, the weather refused to cooperate. Mild winters triggered ice famines. By the 1890s, the technology required less coal, chemical leaks were minimized, and production resulted in cleaner ice. Big city dwellers began to worry about water pollution in rivers and ponds used for ice harvesting. Press published exposés on potential health hazards lurking in natural ice. By the early 1900s, mechanical ice plants had spread across many cities. When World War I created a spike in demand, the US government momentarily encouraged natural ice to conserve coal and ammonia for munitions. After the war, the widespread adoption of electric home refrigerators was the final nail in the coffin. By the 1930s, most American households in major cities could make their own ice at home, eliminating the daily need for an iceman's deliveries. For many in the United States, iced beverages became standard, evolving into a hallmark of American dining. Tudor, who died in 1864 as a wealthy man, never lived to see mechanical refrigeration's golden age, but his pioneering efforts triggered an era of year-round food availability and convenience that we take for granted. He predicted that once people tasted a chilled drink under the summer sun, warm beverages would seem unthinkable. And he was right.